Howdy, friends, and welcome to the StoryField. This is a podcast where we talk about business, faith, and life in general.
Okay, so here's the deal. We want you to be encouraged. We want you living in hope. This life we live is complex. It's hard at times. At the StoryField, you will find great stories of normal people just like us who will inspire you. Our goal is that you leave encouraged, inspired, and excited to move forward in life. But before we get started, one thing though, if you're listening and you find yourself really hopeless right now, send us an email at hope@thestoryfield.com so we can pray for you. Thanks for joining us today. Let's get started.
Well, good morning. StoryField is when we're recording. I have an incredible honor today to interview Dr. Dan Allender. If his name sounds familiar, it wouldn't surprise me because you can find a ton of incredibly helpful resources online and on YouTube, and we'll get to some of that, Dr. Allender. But hey, welcome to the StoryField. Super grateful you're here today.
Thank you, Josh, and good to be with both you and Micah.
Yeah, so today, married people, if you've ever experienced conflicts, I want you to listen in. And that should be all of us, like tuning in a bit. And my hope is today that you'll be encouraged, grab some tips, leave with some great resources, and maybe a new way to think about marriage, and maybe even managing the conflicts or the differences, that you face. So, Dr. Allender, a confession, my first kind of interaction with knowing about you was when you were running around the mountains on the motorcycle with the Eldridge boys and some epic, motorcycle adventure trip in the film, A Story Worth Living. So, and then the particular thing was cool. Now we kind of circle back. I think the Lord really drew me to that movie, especially with the way you were talking with super compassion and wise, super thoughtful. And you seem kind on the film. So it's really cool. Fast forward a year or so later that you're here in front of us today. So thank you.
My delight, but that was such an honor, such a privilege to be on that journey. I also, all you have to do is mention it, and then my ribs hurt.
Yeah, I know.
I,
And I want to ask you, I don't want to bring it up. So, I mean, you broke a rib, didn't you? Or broke some.
yeah, I had 3 ribs and a partially collapsed lung, and
Okay.
at one level, I should have just gone to the hospital, but it's like, I don't know. It sounded like a bumpy ride down, so it just
Oh
seems
my
safer to
gosh.
be on the motorcycle.
Well, and for all who listening, it's called A Story Worth Living. It's really fun to check out. So you can hear what happened to Dr. Allender on that. So, okay. Well, please introduce yourself to the listeners, give a bit of your background, including educational. And I'm asking you to tell me some of the things you're most proud of accomplishing as well. So please, it's okay, like, brag on yourself if you would a little bit, but tell us a little bit, introduce yourself, and then we'll get going.
Well, degrees, to be honest, they largely bore me. I have a
Mm,
PhD, but what's required to be able to get a doctorate is an capacity, an inordinate capacity for boredom. So I'm
yeah.
not sure I really, the educational process. I've done my time. I've done my
Yeah.
time.
Yeah. Thanks.
But, to say, what am I most proud of? Well, I was able to guide my 11-year-old granddaughter and 6-year-old grandson on the Yellowstone, and both caught their first really
Oh,
decent trout. So at one level, when you go, what are you proud of? What are you proud of? I would say the bottom line is my children are 45 to 38. They fiercely love me and don't really put up with a lot of bullshit. So
yeah.
I appreciate that a lot. And we'll talk a little bit about the book, but
Yeah.
the fact that my wife still adores me, but
Mm.
also equally doesn't allow for a whole lot of silliness. Our relationships define us. The things we accomplish, again, they're great. Written some books, been part of starting a school. Uh, but the bottom line is the investment in and the playground of human stories, I think, is
Mm,
the greatest realm of where life is found, where the question of death and resurrection play out in a way
mm,
that nowhere else does.
yeah. Yeah. And, the Allender Center which is, um, a center that you created as a founder, you, there's a phrase in there when I was, doing a little bit of homework that really caught my attention too was you were helping them tell their stories with awareness, integrity, and fast forward to with the courage to confront, their other stories of harm as well. But the stories thing jumped off the page to me as well. Obviously, that's really neat. Appreciate you saying that.
Well, we're just again and again, we are incredibly broken people. The intersection of our own failure of love and others' failure of love.
Mm,
But to also say, being made in the image of God, we are stunningly beautiful. And I think
mm,
for many people, it's harder to face the kind of beauty we bring to the world than to face the reality that we failed. But both and uh, creates that intersection of like your story, my story. They're just broken parts, past, present, and I know future.
mm,
But in that, there's something in the shards that when you pull them together, like the Japanese notion of kintsugi, that take a
mm,
broken pot, use gold to bring it together. There's something in that that really does catch your eye.
mm. And that's what you look for in people
Yeah,
in the stories.
absolutely.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, Um, we're gonna dive into your one of your newest books, Deep Rooted Marriage, and that's why I wanted the married people to tune in, especially. But at the Storyfield, we really like to give a little background of people's actual story. So can you kind of start us from, maybe childhood, kind of where'd you grew up, kind of bring us along the path so we can give a little bit of the background on you and, so we don't just fast forward to today and hit go. So can you give us some background and tell us
Yeah.
about your
Oh,
childhood, all that
absolutely.
good stuff?
Honored. What I would say is that's actually kind of the core of what the deep root of marriage is about, like how your story, past, both the broken and beautiful, show up in the context of your marriage. So the reality is, I married Becky because she was so radically different than my
Mm,
mother. So if you begin a story, where you're from, I'm from Ohio, a small little suburb in Columbus. But the bottom line is, I'm an only child of a possessive, complex, if you know the term borderline personality disorder, which
mhm,
is, if you don't, basically means that one moment, literally one moment, she could be raging, next moment
mm,
weeping, the next moment laughing, and the next moment looking at me like, what's your problem?
mm,
So the reality of unpredictability, emotional chaos was just a part
mm,
of every day. And a father, good, kind man who, when I say the next word, often I'm not believed. He
mm,
could go weeks without speaking a full sentence. He was a monosyllabic man, meaning,
mm,
uh-huh, yeah, no, maybe, shrug a
mm,
shoulder. So I was, in so many ways, my mother's surrogate husband. She looked to me
mm,
for passion, for life, for engagement, for meaning. And I told my best friend at one point when we were about 14, I live in the web of a black widow. And the
mm,
only way that I could cut my way out was by causing trouble. When I created trouble of any sort, there was anywhere from like a day to 3 days where my mother wouldn't speak to me. And those days of not having her interact with me, I'm telling you, was like being sent to the Bahamas. So
mm,
the reality was, I grew up causing trouble. Was on first name basis with the principal, eventually the
mm,
superintendent, from, you know, selling drugs, selling alcohol, stealing
mm,
cars, breaking into homes. But again, I'm a middle class kid, so
mm,
none of the repercussions that many people face when they get caught. On the other hand, I was a very good football player in a
Mm.
context where winning was so crucial that when I got arrested, one of the first phrases that would often be used is, "Do you know who this kid is?" Meaning,
Oh.
not that my name was important, but my position where I played was important.
Oh, wow.
And so, that intersection between I'm a bad kid, but I'm also a furious and in many ways fierce football
Mm.
player. So I'm getting away with murder while simultaneously creating chaos for myself and for others. And that's the context in which, age 13, I met my best friend, a gentleman by the name of Tremper Longman III, a
Oh,
renowned, truly renowned Old Testament scholar now. But
wow.
we basically were best friends. He was as good, truly as good as the the driven snow. I'm as bad as you can be. And somehow this Mutt and Jeff became a relationship. And he, in the context of his family, knew Jesus. And so from age 13,
Mm.
14 on, I'm hearing things about God and then the Bible. And I had zero. When I say zero, I mean no religious background, didn't know what the Bible was. And when he told me the first time, well, the Bible is God's word, I'm like, God spoke? He what? He spoke where? Well, it's called the Old and New Testament. The what? So the whole
Mm.
thing was beyond, I mean, beyond ridiculous. I love my friend, and I was mocking his core faith orientation. But that
Wow.
relationship continued from 13. We ended up in college together. I was involved at that point in illicit pharmaceutical sales, and a group in Cleveland called the Cleveland Mafia put out contracts against a number of small little middle class drug dealers. And it was the first time that I finally kind of heard what Tremper had been talking about for literally almost a decade. And that context of thinking I might be dead at any moment
Wow.
opened the door to a moment where I was walking down the street realizing I could be killed in any drive-by shoot by, and just sort of went, fine, fine, fine.
Mm.
Okay, that was my inviting Jesus into my heart.
Yeah.
And that night we went literally for the first time for me to be in a church. And the dude was preaching on Balaam's ass, which was incredible. Like, I didn't know that y'all used language like that, like Balaam's ass, nobody seemed to be troubled by that. And then I'm hearing a little bit more, and then all of a sudden I hear that Balaam's ass spoke to him. And I'm thinking,
Your
good God,
first time in church.
good God. Balaam's ass spoke to him? Like, you got talking body parts? And so it was such a relief a little bit later when I heard it was Balaam's donkey. And I'm like, oh, we're just talking about talking animals, which I spent a lot of time hallucinating. So talking animals was no problem. So that's the beginning of my journey.
How old were you then? Like, were you college aged?
21.
Oh, okay. Wow. I don't know if I've heard of a start like that. That's amazing. So what happened from there? So were you in school beyond high school at that
No,
point? I
no,
mean,
we were still in college.
okay.
And I remember because I spent a lot of time working on my business, so I paid a lot of people to go to classes for me. So
Okay.
Tremper was graduating, and at one point, he said, "Are you graduating?" And I'm like, "I don't know." And he said, "Well, you ought to just go find out." And so I did,
Mm.
and I found out I was graduating like in a couple
Oh
months.
my.
And I'm like, wow, okay. I had to ask what my major was. And they told me it was philosophy and religion. And I was like, well, okay, that's fine. Though Tremper was then at that point saying, what are you planning on doing? And I'm like, well, I'm not going to get a job, but I think I'll go to law school. And he was like, well, you've got to take the law school admissions test to get in. I'm like, oh, what a bummer. I thought I could just sort of show up and go to classes. He said, well, the only kind of school that would let you in is where I'm going, and that is to a seminary. And I'm like, why would I go to a seminary? I had a conversion, but let's just say it didn't take too deep.
Yeah.
And so at that juncture, uh, he just made an interesting proposition. He said, why don't you come with me to seminary and just think about God for a year? Then you can go to law school. Well, that year was a fascinating year. So finished seminary, ended up in a church, still pretty troubled kid. And
Mm.
the only group that they would let me work with happened to be two alcoholics, a marriage that was collapsing, and then an old, I mean, at this point, I'm like 24 or 5, a vaudeville ex-actor and his prostituted wife. And so, in other words, they gave me a group where the a sense was I probably can't do any more harm than they've already indeed suffered. But it
Oh,
opened the door to a level of like, oh, this is good to be involved in people's stories and then thinking about the Bible. I'm like, what a better way to spend a lifetime. So that's again a little more to it than that, but let's just say that's been the overall trajectory of my life.
oh my. And that, I mean, those were even the beginning stages of all the work you would do with, I mean, your clients and the trauma stuff and brokenness and stories. That's unbelievable. What was your relationship like? I mean, whenever you kind of had the moment where you walked and you were hearing about Balaam's ass and the conversion, did you see yourself kind of on a trajectory of slowly getting drawn to the Lord, slowly changing, or was it a kind of just a long process to kind of untangle the past?
Oh, Josh, it's a
Oh
great
yeah.
question. And let's just say, when I was younger, I didn't think I'd live beyond 21, 22.
Mm,
But, when all of a sudden you realize, I might live a little longer. And then all of a sudden it's like, well, how do I want to live? I'm not particularly concerned about house or money or wife or
mm,
friends or whatever. And it's like, wow, there's a whole lifetime ahead. And I know without question how troubled and broken and needing of grace I am. Other people seem to not be. Like the small group that I began with, particularly this vaudeville couple and his prostituted wife, they were troubled, obviously, but there was an honesty, a kind of freedom to engage. So, the realm of very broken people has been a realm that I feel very comfortable in
mm,
because I was, and in some sense, until the Lord returns, or I join him and become as he is, that brokenness is just a reality. But then to be able to say over multiple years, understanding something of my goodness, the beauty that God has put within me, that's come a lot through relationship with Becky. So, when I say, my marriage has been, without question, the best taste of what I think heaven will hold. I've never known grace and kindness and the face of God like I have known through her, and not but and moments with both of us where we've tasted one another's failures at a level that's felt like a taste of hell that I'll never have to endure for eternity.
mm,
So, marriage, from my standpoint, is a relationship of extremity. If things are just stable for you, like they're pretty flat lined, you kind of go, well, if
mm.
it's a heartbeat, if it's flat lined, you're dead.
Yeah.
But the ups and downs, they're not just things to resolve and overcome, they're revelatory. And I think that's
Mm,
one of the core principles that I don't think people get, that marriage is revelatory. It's going to reveal to you and to others your very, very best. The best of who you are will be in your marriage. And what I've implied
mm,
is, and the worst. So,
mm,
can we engage what comes to the surface and in one sense be curious, honoring of it, and indeed learn from what God has for us in it. That's been in so many ways, like from the beginning of my relationship with God, not having had a single moment in church, a
Mm,
single moment of sort of religious background. In some ways, it's freed me from what I think at times to be the insanity of the church.
mm,
Not to say I'm a mature person, but saying that so many of the sort of the rules and means by which we think God comes to value us, I'm like, wow, you don't really believe in grace.
yeah.
But you really do believe grace and works are sort of a combination to kind of get you
Mm,
by. But the radical, almost not just unbelievable, almost completely unbelievable reality is someone like me could be favored by
mm.
the God of the universe. That still to this day, as a 73-year-old man, still just sort of whacks me out.
Oh, yeah. Wow. Okay, before we get into the book, tell us about where did your bride come onto the scene? Like, how did you meet her? Like, I want to set that backdrop as well.
Yeah, 10th grade French
Oh,
class.
okay.
So, my name begins with an A. I'm the first student on the far right. She's a G, Gilbert. She's on the second row, third seat back. And 10th grade, I'm dropping my pencil so I can surreptitiously take a look at her legs.
Yeah.
Beautiful, beautiful legs.
Mm.
So, but she's sort of in the in crowd, as you can well imagine. I'm not. So
Yeah.
I'm trying to position myself when she's about to depart French class to walk out with her. And we have this like 10 to 20-second little interaction where we both pretend we're from Brooklyn. And in that interaction, like it's just a human contact, but I didn't have enough courage. I carried a 9 millimeter, but not
Mm,
enough courage to ask her out for a date. So,
mm,
um, years after that, we're in Fort Lauderdale. Too long a story, but I'd
mm,
finished a drug deal, came out to the beach,
mm,
finally realized I'm not going to get busted, and this beautiful girl walks by. And I couldn't remember her name, but I knew her. It was Becky. I followed her, finally got her name, invited her to a party, spent dinner with 20 some friends. And a good friend of mine, not Tremper, but another good friend, started hitting on her. And it was like, I'll kill you.
mm.
But killing him at that moment would not have attracted Becky. So I didn't know what to do. I didn't have a clue what to do. To like. So I looked at her and I just said, "Would you like to fly to Pluto?" And she looked at me and she goes, "Yeah, I would love that." So we got ice buckets, got some blankets, went to the beach, and I flew her for about 3.5 hours to Pluto and back. And part of that is I talk a lot. Um, but that was the role I had with my mom. I
Mm,
was a storyteller from third or fourth grade. I remember walking home organizing stories because my job at dinner was to create a intriguing environment where the conflict between my mom and dad didn't erupt.
mm.
So if you want to do a podcast of about 8 hours, I'm fine
Yeah.
because I've got the ability to keep on talking. And that's what we did on the beach. And that was a moment for me where I'm sold. Ended up losing her phone number, made contact literally by going to the airport 5 or 6 days later and then realizing that I didn't have my ticket. Called my mom to essentially get me a new ticket. She wouldn't do it. Ended up, I remembered that Becky was staying somewhere called the Beach Blank Hotel. Well,
Mm.
you can guess there are a number of Beach Blank hotels.
Yeah.
So I had about $5. I had about 9,500 in my luggage that I already given away to the handlers, and $5 turned to dimes, began calling. And here's the moment. After about $4, checking out Becky Gilbert, no Becky Gilbert, four girls from Ohio. How do I know where the girls are? And then I realized they were driving a white Datsun. About $1.50 left. Guy goes, wait a minute, there's a white Datsun leaving right now. And I begged him, run out, stop him, stop him. And Becky came in. I asked, can I get a ride back? And in that trip, let's just say I fell. I was already falling madly in love with her. And a handful more stories before, 5 years after that, we both came to Christ. In that framing, our relationship has been built on story. That story that I just told you is our origin story that I look back and go, how is it possible a already hallucinating kid stuck in Fort Lauderdale finds enough whatever to put dimes in a machine and then finds her right before she leaves. And then we ended up on a trip, 20 some hours back, ended up getting into a bit of a brawl in Georgia, got shot at. I mean, things where you go, my wife, and I mean this damn well, should have known this was not a man you want to marry.
Yeah.
Um,
Oh,
so
Well,
wow.
I'm beyond grateful that, I mean, honestly, the best con job I've ever pulled off in my life. I remember the day when we were dating and she said something like, oh, I've always wanted to walk the Appalachian Trail. I didn't know what it was, but I said to her, that's unbelievable. Me too. So, in so many ways, courting was just an abysmal act of deception to see if I could somehow capture the heart of a really good woman. And as I said, it's been a wild 48 years.
Oh,
this
wow.
needs to be a screenplay somewhere. We need to
That's
go
what
ahead and
I was
write this
thinking,
up
man.
and
That story was amazing.
like a
Like,
Netflix miniseries. Bad
wow.
boy gets the good girl,
Yeah.
then they both turn good. Some drugs,
Uh,
Yeah,
I
well,
mean,
the
that's
real
pretty
issue,
awesome.
the real issue, Mike, is who's this woman who can get shot at car and still, at least a number of years later, go, yeah, I think I'll marry him. Yeah. So, I mean, we've gotten into a lot of trouble, and again, in the context of starting schools, ministry, et cetera, et cetera. And, there are just times where she's like in appropriate heartache. And I'm like, you knew this. You knew we'd be run out
Yeah.
of town, didn't you? I mean, so the process of finding the intersection of, well, like, why would she have married me? Well, in so many ways, I was so much more attuned to her than her cruel mother.
Mm.
Yet, in so many ways, I was playful and wild like her father. In so many ways, she was the antithesis of my mom, but engaged me and was intrigued by my stories. So we all marry for redemption. We don't even know it. We don't even know what we're marrying for, other than I thought she is beautiful and had beautiful
Mm.
legs,
Mm.
and she was funny and fun. That's the level of maturity I had at that juncture. And yet, when I look back, I'm married because I was trying to redeem the harm, that my family of origin in many ways brought. But also, I didn't have a clue, but I was dreaming of what eternity would hold. What does it really mean to have a level of love like I experienced? So we marry to resolve the past and to, in many ways, create an anticipation of what heaven will be.
Wow. That's beautiful. Well, can I ask you just to kind of maybe close the story loop, I guess, for me with how did things end up with your mom and dad?
Well, yeah, with my mom, after my father died, and again, the complexity is,
Mm.
I found out at age 19 that the man that I thought was my father was my stepfather. My
Oh,
father actually died when I was about 4 years of age in an auto accident. My mother and father and I were in.
wow.
But no memory of that until I found a photo of my mom, me, and this man I had never seen before. And I put it in front of her and she looked at it and she goes, oh, that's your father. And I'm like, the man upstairs in bed? She goes, no, that's your stepfather. It's like finding out that your mother and father work for the KGB. Um,
Yeah.
and again, so deeply disturbing. But in that, I began to hear my own story. Like, who was my father? How did we get
Mm,
here? And so, over many years, especially after coming to Christ, I began sharing the gospel to both my mom and dad. My father, in rage at one point, shattered a wine glass in a restaurant and said, "Never talk to me about Jesus again." So, for many, 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 many years, we essentially skirted the issue. But 6 weeks before he died, I sat with him on a porch and needed to confess to him that I had failed him as a son on many levels. And he acknowledged his own failure. And that was a context where I was able to say, indeed, I forgive you for your cowardice, your lack of engagement, etc. But there will be a day you stand, and we didn't know it would be 6 weeks, but a day you will stand before the living God. And I shared the gospel, and it was the context where he began to share with me stories. He was in the first wave at Iwo Jima, the second wave at
mm,
Peleliu. Terrible, terrible stories that he had never shared. Um, Shared the story literally having his best friend's head blown off and into his lap.
mm,
So he was a man who had been wickedly traumatized by war, and yet, like many good men of that generation, chose to, in one sense, bury it. And in that, there was a humility and an openness that I had never experienced. And one of the sweetest moments, truly, of my life, my father invited Jesus to be his Lord and Savior 6 weeks before he perished. So, and then a whole lot more conversations after he died with my mom. And for a period of about 5 years, she went to a small Baptist little church, came to Christ through a lovely woman in that congregation. And we had 5 years before Alzheimer's began to take her away. That
mm.
was really, really sweet. So, when you begin to
Wow.
look at redemption and you go, wow, you had really literally one conversation with your father where your father was a father. That's precious to me. There's a lot of heartache with regard to what he failed to engage, but that one moment is, again, to say it's enough. No, it's not enough, but it's sweet to still hold on to. And those 5 years with my mom, where I was able to address, like, why would you, as a mom, take me, a 12-year-old boy, when we're in Paris, to the Moulin Rouge, where I'm literally in the presence of vastly unclothed, beautiful women? My first, in one sense,
Mm,
uh, sexual experience is with my mom in a version of a strip club. So we had hard conversations,
mm.
yet there was grief, honor, forgiveness. So I look forward. I look forward to being with both of them, but still,
Wow.
still,
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Wow.
Unstuck Coaches hates it when movement and progress in a person's life or business is stuck, or frozen, or slowed, or just stopped altogether. Well, we have found a solution. Unstuckcoaches.com. They offer a variety of coaching services to get you or your business moving again. Check out unstuckcoaches.com.
Hey, y'all. I just want to make an observation. When I see someone going through a legal situation, it seems like there are way too many unknowns. Well, the Allen firm provides legal guidance so that you can make a great decision, come to a resolution, and be at peace. For more information about the Allen firm, visit allenlawfirm.com.
Okay, man. People may be mad if I don't get into deep-rooted marriage. I mean, we've been talking about. Uh, I mean, I've been making notes over here about just we married for redemption, and I mean these type of things. But can you first give us a flyby, a big picture? Um, why did you guys write this book? And then give us a flyby of what's in it.
Well, like Becky and I had a point of conflict, and again, unpleasant point of conflict about 2 weeks ago over whether a baked potato was done. And we were planning on like having the baked potato, and I didn't think it was. I didn't think it was even close to being done. She thought it was done. So we're in the middle of this nasty interaction where you're going, wait a minute. I mean, post-dictive, looking at this, going, are you kidding? You wrote a book on marriage. I've written several books on marriage,
Mm.
and you've been married 48 years. And this is the level of maturity that the two of you have. And the answer is we both got triggered. And I think
Mm.
that's where I want people to be aware, to engage. We all get triggered because I don't care how good a mom and dad, how good a family you had. The reality is you grew up with sinners. And sin, as Jesus talks about in Matthew 5, involves lust and anger. And we unfortunately think of lust as exclusively being sexual, but it's not. It includes that, but it's any desire gone mad. And all parents, to some degree, use their children to fill some basic core emptiness. And when we don't get what we want from our children or others, we get angry. Well, Jesus sort of ups the ante to call that adultery and murder. So I grew up with adulterer and murderers, and everyone does. Unless you say your mom and dad aren't sinners, then First John 3
Yeah, I was gonna say there's a Bible
says,
that talks about that.
then you're a liar. So, Scripture sort of paints you in the corner. And so the reality is we all get triggered by deeply unaddressed and wounded parts of us that show up even when there's been good work and healing. But in this case, the baked potato fight, we had to separate literally. Like Becky at one point just said, "Take a walk. Just take a walk. We can heat the dinner up later. Take a walk." And in that walk, I'm like, Jesus, what's going on? And again, this is one of those moments where it really was clear. And Jesus just says, the kitchen was a war zone for you. And it was. I mean, my mom hated cooking, the wretched corn and mushy
Mm.
peas from a can. That would be the substance of a meal. The best meal would be a Swanson's TV dinner. So
Mm.
when I go into the kitchen, that's a war zone for me. And for Becky, it's the one place where her very, very critical mother showed love by how she made food. So for both of us, we have different world experiences in that kitchen. For me, it's a war zone. For Becky, it's a place of love. So for me to question her decision making as to whether a big I'm threatening a part of her that indeed made her really angry, and she was not addressing the fact that food is particularly the kitchen is a place of great heartache. So if you don't know what's triggering you because you've not done the work of looking at how the wounds of life have shown themselves in certain realms, you're not going to be able to make sense of what's happening over issues of sex, over issues of your children or money or in-laws. So important to know the roots. That's why we call it the
Mm.
deep rooted marriage. What are the roots of this kind of triggering? Now, I would love to say, because we've done this work, I wrote a book, blah, blah,
Mm.
that we handled it quickly and well. It took a while. But in that labor, we were able to come back with a level of understanding like, oh, sweetheart, this has been the place where you're not just a great chef, cook. This has been where love has been, and I was threatening that. And for her to be able to say, the kitchen is a place where even though I've fed you pretty well over 48 years, there's still a fundamental raw part of you. So just understanding opens the door to more compassion, more capacity to engage without contempt. which opens the door, I think, to a world more curiosity on behalf of one another. And we are the face of God to one another. And if there's not compassion, there's not mercy. If there's not curiosity, there's not honor. And we were made for delight and honor. And that is what we're trying to get folks
Wow.
thinking about in the context of this book.
So give us some tools. I mean, I'm just thinking what's really cool about that is you're not telling me if the potato is between me and my wife. You're not telling me like, why are you so mad? Or it's not about her really at all and her view of the potato. I mean, it's once you get curious on why you're getting so mad about the potato,
Yeah.
that type of thing. So how does somebody start if they find themselves in that impasse and conflict? How to give us some tips, like just even if it's a step or two, how do we start
Yeah. Well, I
to
love this
be
passage.
healthy?
Luke 7, really 1 through 7, but I'll capture just a few things. And that is, it begins with don't judge, don't judge.
Mm,
But in not judging, you've got to deal with the log in your own eye. So there, the whole question of like, researchers by the name of the Gottmans have been able to establish in a way that's really very, very verified. 70% of what we have fights over have no legitimate right answer. That's really
oh,
amazing. Amazing. When you start looking at the last couple fights you've had with your spouse, and then you start with that framework, and that is 70%, no, there's no right answer as to whether you go to the beach or whether you go to the mountains, whether you go out to dinner for Italian, whether you stay home. So when you begin to realize so much of the fight that you have with your spouse is about things that are not on the surface, but are below.
mm,
So asking the question, what's blinding me? What's the log? Now we think the log is sin, and it can be, but the log is anything that keeps you from being able to see reality well. See reality about yourself, about your spouse, about 70%. There are no answers, no right or wrong answers. Then it begins to be a realm where you've got a chance to be able to say, my gosh, where have I been blinded and created judgments that actually have no real validity? So it may sound too simple or actually too difficult. Start with yourself. Where are you
mm,
blind? That's a hard thing to ask because if you can't see, you can't see. But you do have a spouse who's been with you, even if it's only for a few weeks, they know something and they've been reading your mail over a long period. So to be able to say to your spouse, where do you see me? To be particularly blind when we're having conflict or when how I spend money, how I spend time, how I look at others. Where do you see my blindness? And so asking that and inviting a good friend to be able to speak, you're beginning to look at the themes of how you've handled trauma in your life. The typical ways are fight, flight, freeze, and the word fawn, meaning smile, 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 just be pleasant, and you'll avoid it. Well, from what I've told you, I'm a classic fight. Like I, Becky at one point looks at me and she goes, I guess I never asked why you have a scar underneath your right eye. I said, well, that was a bar fight. I didn't know you were a bar fighter. Come on. We got shot at in one of the first major dates.
oh my gosh.
What data did you need beyond that? So fight has been the way I survived in the context of my family of origin. She was a flea, flee the conflict. Literally, she played in closets because it was safer to be hidden than out in the open. Well, that works really well when you got one who's loud and belligerent and intense, one who's more quiet and hidden. Look, our marriage looked really good for a few years until she began to grow and began to invite
Mm,
me to grow. And as we're beginning to name where the ways we interact work but don't work, actually work but don't increase our love of Jesus and our maturity, that's where you begin to go deal with the log in your own eye. Now, it also says, as you deal with the log in your own eye, deal with the speck in the other, meaning we've got to have a conversation about how our relationship, in many ways, fuels the demands of the other, which is another way of saying lust. It's got to be open. We got to be open to how we make one another pay. That's anger. That's murder.
Mm.
So I'm married to an adulterer, aren't you? I'm married to a murderer, aren't you? And if not, like, wow, how did you pick somebody who never left Eden? I'd love to
Yeah.
know.
Wow. But how is there, man, there's no magic answer to any of this. I know that. Um, it seems like you have to be in the right mindset or have the right attitude for both parties to be able to work on this.
Yeah, absolutely brilliant
Is
point.
is there any encouragement you can give us on things you've seen to work to help that sometime? Because
Well,
sometimes we
if
don't, we're blind, like you said.
Yeah, I was just in a conversation yesterday with a man who was talking about his golf game, how much money he spent, enormous, how much time he spent working on this slice. I don't play golf. I have no,
Mm, mm.
it's a lovely gift of God, and yet many people ruin it by making it a God. So
Yeah. Yeah.
so, all to say that as he described the amount of time, effort, thought, he reads magazine articles, he has Golf Digest, blah, 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 blah. Yeah. And then I said, how much time do you think about what it means to honor your wife? And just looked at me like, what? What do you mean? And I'm like, what do I mean?
Mm,
Like, you polish like the heads of your clubs. He was
mm,
talking about like a polish that he used that felt like it, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like,
mm,
oh, I'm not faulting you, but what's the energy for a game that frustrates you when you don't put much at all into the labor of creating delight and honor for your wife? So, back to a simple point. Do you actually see your marriage as little more than convenience and comfort and pleasure? If so, then you use your spouse, male or female. You use them instead of seeing them
mm,
as a reflection of the image of God, that is, of God, and therefore as one that you not worship, but that you hold with a sense of awe and delight,
mm,
gratitude. So that framework of you will one day have the living God look at you with the question of how did you love your wife? How did you love your husband? How did you love your children? How did you love your friends? How did you love your enemies? And are you aware there are times your wife was your enemy? How did you love her when she was your enemy? That framework, I don't think God's particularly interested in you perfecting your slice.
mm,
But given that, then the intent to say every day is a day in which, because of, I floss every day because I don't like the dentist. Do I have, in one sense, a perspective on every day I get to think about my wife? I get to be thinking about how I bring her something of the goodness of God in the land of the living. So that's the
mm,
intent. I'm not saying
mm,
that the two of us are just happy as a clam. Well, what I'd say is we continue. Baked potato is just one of many examples of failing one another, where we need to be under the goodness of God and the mercy of God in order for us to grow in our relationship. So I don't think there's anyone on the earth that is more important to your growth as a human being and your growth in relationship with God. The quality of your marriage will determine the quality of how you parent. And parenting, if there is one world guaranteed to drive you to your knees,
Mm.
it would be that as well.
Oh, wow. Yeah. So the encouragement is, yeah, I mean, it's hard to summarize kind of what you said on for the guy with a golf game or whatever. I mean, the encouragement is like the delight and awe of your spouse is worth the effort in looking at yourself and looking at these triggers and yeah. Mm,
And then knowing that we're going to differ on almost all desire. Yeah, again, when we often think our desires should be equivalent in our spouse or vice
mm,
versa, and to go, our sexual desires never equal. Our
mm,
desire for spending or saving never equal, et cetera, et cetera. So as you begin to go, differences often are the context for conflict.
mm,
Then we don't want to be in conflict. So we create these demilitarized zones, sort of like, okay, we're not going to go there. We know every time we go there, things are not good. And we want it to be good. We want comfort and convenience. So we avoid it. Well, what do you think evil does in ground where you both choose not to walk? It will sow seeds of discord, of conflict. And
mm,
the typical realm as a marriage therapist, how many people have I seen divorce literally because of something equivalent to the toothpaste cap? And the answer is tragically many. Is it the toothpaste cap you put on or didn't put on? No. It's that it represents so much unaddressed reality. So it's like storing dynamite in your basement.
mm,
Every day you avoid, every day that you just sort of cover over, you're literally creating a nightmare that will blow at some point. In which case, I mean, if you look at the data currently, divorce among people who are 50 and above, what's called gray divorce, is the
mhm,
largest group of folks. 35% of all divorce is occurring now 50 and above, often instituted by the woman because she's empty. She's frustrated and she's tired and she's financially capable of being independent. And you kind of go, oh my God, how did we get here? Where over the busyness of kids, of starting business, of
mm,
growing, having enough time to be able to be involved in ministry, but also care for your body. I mean, the age you both are, I don't
mm,
envy.
mm, mm,
I'm grateful to be in the last, who knows,
mm,
lap or small portion of a lap. On the other hand, the reality of being able to go, it's the greatest season for defining what you really are about in
mm,
life. And if it's not, I want our hearts to be bound together in a way in which we really do when we go to church. When we walk in the woods together, when we make love, there is
mm,
something of awe and gratitude for one another that actually opens the door to that echo of gratitude of thank you. No, thank you. No, thank you for thanking me. No, thank you for
mm,
thanking me for thanking you,
mhm,
to a point where, again, there's nothing more than you want to say than I thank God for you.
mm. Wow. Um, yeah, I'm thinking on the neutral zone and even though word compromise, like, I mean, having a neutral zone or just like compromising, I don't know if that's really getting to the healing you're looking for. Um,
It's a counterfeit. I'm all for
mm,
compromise, but
mm,
only in the realm of creativity.
mm,
So where one of you is like, whatever. Yeah, yeah, you seem to want this. Let's just do it. Versus being able to go, no, your differences and conflict are meant to create an even deeper level of intimacy
mm,
because you understand what matters to the other and something of the roots of how that desire has come to be. So within that, your ability to be able to go, wow, like we literally did a baked potato last night
mhm.
and we're laughing. And it's like, we had it in for 55 minutes at about 430 degrees. And at that point, when we took it out, we're looking at one another, and I'm like, You want to put the fork in first, or do you want me to? And then, but it's playful. It's like we're able to remember a really ugly battle where there was carnage, and yet where there is both understanding and grief, but also playfulness of the resurrection. That ability told death and resurrection, grief and laughter. I think is what makes a marriage, in many ways, a powerful witness of Jesus's death and resurrection. So
Mm.
holding that and being able to go, hey, your view. And she said, I think it's done. And I'm like, well, let's cut this sucker in half because mine is not. Uh,
Yeah. Going back in the oven, yeah. Well, so differences then, I mean, I'm just thinking, Dr. Allender, of like, I mean, me, how do I, when I encounter a difference, you know, and it's clear, it's the potato thing, it's whatever it is, how do I approach it going forward in a more healthy way more marriage honoring, spouse honoring, not so self-defensive give us some advice on that.
Yeah, well, I would start with, if you like really sort of overdone baked potatoes like I do, don't turn against your own heart. But also don't take your own desire as if it is magnificent and narcissistically true. So start with that. Like, know what you desire, and then at least have enough curiosity to go, what's going on with that? I don't think you need to think through every jot and tittle,
Mm,
but particularly the ones that create conflict. Yeah, you do. You do. But you also need to have a curiosity as to, like, why do you like antiques, my love? Antiques are like it's old, and usually it's broken. And given that I don't know how to fix things, you want to buy furniture that reveals eventually my incompetence. I don't like that. And she's like, well, thank God you have a son who, from the time he was 4, was more mechanical than you. We can always invite him to be part of helping fix. So there are compromises, but they come out of the creativity of the
that's it.
engagement with desire. So much more story. Like you may know your husband grew up with an alcoholic father and that he was rough and mean at times sloppy, uh, sad over his failure. Well, instead of just knowing the fact, do you know the stories? But most of us don't want to get near the stories, meaning we don't want to tell what it was like when we were 4, 8, 12 at the dinner table being humiliated by a drunk man who made you feel like dirt. Well,
Mm,
stories are where we begin to grow, not just in compassion, but also deep respect. Like how my wife learned to hide from, in many ways, a cruel mother. She was brilliant, brilliant,
mm,
and resourceful and independent. It's part of why I married her. It's broken. It's beautiful. Can you hear both going on? Where brokenness invites us to grieve for one another, truly, to be able to say, I'm so sad that you have suffered this. Yet, the brilliance of how she learned to survive in that
mm,
context is majestic. She's beautiful. So, holding both together becomes the frame for being able to engage one another with so much more sensitivity, empathy, so much more honor because my ability to talk has literally at times saved me from being killed. Those are stories
mm,
for her to be able to say, you basically provided for our family financially in the same way that you spoke as an 8-year-old at the kitchen table, keeping your mom and dad alive. Thank you. Thank you. And I'm so sorry that you've only been able to use words when there was so much more that you wanted to offer. So,
mm,
holding death and resurrection on behalf of one another, I think creates a level of intimacy that nothing else can and nothing else will.
That's so good. How does shame and resentment and judgment get in the way of all this?
Oh,
Can you
yeah,
speak on that? I know that's a
uh,
huge
uh,
question, but what comes
yeah.
to
Well,
mind?
again, let me just go back to the silly baked potato. I was shaming my wife, not purposely, but by questioning her judgment, she felt a rush of shame. When she got angry with me with regard to it's done, I felt the same. So, what we can say is shame is the experience of being exposed and exposed as well, whatever, as foolish, as stupid, as selfish, as whenever you feel a sense of there's something about me that's bad because of X, Y, or Z, and that gets exposed. Well, again, we go back to Genesis 3. What did Adam do? What did Eve do? They hid, they covered, and then they blamed. So that's
Mm,
the model to look at your marriage. How do you
mm,
hide? I hide with my belligerence, with my verbosity. Becky hides by her quiet, literally by essentially hiding in a closet. Cover. How do you cover? Well, as a dear friend said to me, you're one of the most intense people I've ever met. My intensity becomes one of the ways that I cover over so much of my own sense of I don't know what I'm doing. If you look confident, fake it till you make it, blah, blah.
mm,
You can then cover yourself and all those core wounds and insecurities. Then when I get caught, I'm really good at blaming. Becky's better at blaming herself, which made our marriage at one point absolutely wonderful. I'm blaming her, she's blaming herself, and we have something really in common. It's her fault. Well, when she began to see that that was so much of how she survived her own family of origin trauma and how I survived my own family, and that is by being, in many ways, a troublemaker and belligerent in the context of my interaction with my mom or my dad. As we began to see, I'm really good at other centered contempt. She's really good at self contempt. But contempt is the number one. I'm telling you, research indicates it's the number one killer of all marriages. So, how the two of you pass contempt to yourself or to the other in the midst of your interaction is how we attempt to escape shame. So, how did Adam and Eve escape shame? Well, Adam blames Eve, Eve blames the serpent. Well, blaming is another word for the word contempt. So,
mm,
how you distribute judgment to yourself or others, that's going to be disrupted in a marriage. Otherwise, oh, it's so tragic to say. Otherwise, you're just letting weeds grow. Maybe you cut them off at the top. But again, back to why we call it a deep rooted marriage. What happens with a weed, you cut off at the top, weeds just the roots just grow stronger. So when we begin to say every marriage, every person struggles with shame and contempt, can we engage that as part of what we are looking to mature and grow in and through in our marriage? Well, shame produces a sense of shame. So even talking about shame becomes
mm,
shameful. And the moments of shame, your struggle with pornography, the fact that you checked out a girl as she walks by and you're sitting with your wife, or the fact that your wife actually has more sexual desire than you do.
mm,
All those things, particularly with regard to our sexuality, that bring that sense of, I feel naked and ashamed. That, oh my, has to be part of the work of growing truly a deep rooted marriage in a way that most couples go back to the DMZ. Most of us escape it,
mm,
just put it off. We don't want conflict. We don't want to be divided. It builds up and it will show itself.
mm. This feels just like a giant invitation to married people. It's so good. It's really encouraging, really hopeful, but there's work involved. As we
Yeah.
kind of land the plane and start heading that direction, do any practices come to mind that maybe you could give us some help with that could create intimacy and a space for, working on some of this stuff? Do you have anything that you've seen really
Oh,
helpful?
every day, we get up at about 4:35 in the morning. We have separate places that we tend to go. We don't want to talk in the morning. Early morning, like I might greet her, morning, morning. That's it.
Yeah.
For at least 45 minutes, no effort to engage. That we need to engage the living God for a period of time. After about 45, 50 minutes of being awake, we go on a 45-minute walk. And that 45-minute walk cements, it's the solidification of our hearts. Now, how do you do that if you've got children? How do you do that if you've got both of you heading off to work? Yeah, there are certain advantages to being near death. As a 73-year-old man, I got more time than you got, probably. But 5 minutes, when people say to me, I don't have time to work out, it's like, do you have 1 minute?
Yeah.
Um, then do 10 deep knee bends. Don't tell me that that's just absolute bullshit.
Mhm.
So what 5 minutes do you have where you can sit with one another and just look in one another's face? Not just doing something like, well, what's your day look like? Well, what's ahead? That good, important information to hold for one another. But even something like, what's your heart desire today?
Mhm.
And not, don't, no, 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 not about the details. What do you desire? Is there anything you're aware of that you desire? 5 minutes, prefer 15, prefer 30, prefer 45, but start with five. So when you begin to craft intentional time where you're going, and I had a good friend who I was able to give the book to before it came out, and he said, my wife and I read 3 or 4 paragraphs and then have a 5 minute discussion. And I'm like, glory be to God. You don't have to read the whole book in one sitting, but if you will allow yourself 1 or 2 or 3 paragraphs and then a conversation, you can begin to craft a level of connection that in those very small moments, because they're built around intentionality and honor, they're going to open the door to difficult conversations. You're going to need more than 5 minutes. You're going to need a half hour. When do you plan that? And then you begin to note, wait a minute, how much time do I play with, gaming? How much time am I on screens? Well, Apple will tell you if you own one of those little machines, how much time are you on a screen that has nothing to do with your work? Well, all to say that when you begin to have this intent, it becomes the realm where there is so much joy, so much danger, so much life that in many ways, the idea of not being on a 45-minute walk, where this morning, part of our time walking was praying about the conversation today. And so when I finish, though I won't see my wife for another 4 or 5 hours, she will ask, how did StoryField go today?
Mhm.
And I'll say, it's so good to be with Josh and Micah.
Mhm.
And here's some of the questions. So the playground of life becomes what brings a taste of the goodness of God in the land of the living.
That's so good. Well, I'm assuming people can get um, the Deep Rooted Marriage on Amazon and everywhere else. Is there a particular place you would love for people to go check it out?
Absolutely. Your local bookstore.
Okay.
I'm not, I mean, I order from Amazon
Mm,
far too much, but
mm.
the idea that I'm just helping Bezos get richer kind
Yeah.
of ticks me
Yeah.
off. So
Cool.
if you have a local bookstore, Christian or otherwise, I'd love for you to get the book there. But if you're like me, you probably want more convenience, but you can get it from Jeff. Jeff will personally deliver it to you.
Thanks. Well, in the interview, Dr. Allender, with some encouragement to people as you wrap it up, and then we'll stop it.
There is no joy like the reality of looking at your beloved and knowing, especially as an older man, I don't have many more days left. As a young man, and I would put both of you in that category as younger men, you got decades likely, but you don't know. We have dear, dear friends who just got the diagnosis of a cancer that will likely take her life by the time she's 42 years of age. You don't know how many days you have. And some of the most important gifts that you give to your children and your world is the quality of the joy you know in your marriage, but also the quality of the tears in your own marriage. So the framework here keeps coming back to he didn't give us a spouse for mere children, sex, or even intimacy, but to reveal something about the very nature of who God is. So when we get that sense of, I get to reveal the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit through the nature of how I live in my marriage, it creates not pressure, not demand, but incredible gift.
Wow, what an invitation. I've been so honored to have you on.
Thank you, Josh.
It's amazing. So thank you for what you're doing. Thank you for your honest, authentic, and encouragement.
Thank
And
you.
we look forward to
Privilege.
following you, and we bless you.
Thank you. Thank you. And to you as well.
Thanks.
Thank you for joining us on this latest edition to the StoryField podcast. We hope that you have been challenged, inspired, and ready to take that next step, whatever that is. If you know someone with an amazing story that needs to be heard, send us an email at info@thestoryfield.com. Have a fantastic day, and we can't wait for you to join us on the next episode of The StoryField.